Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Happy New Year. Hope everyone had a lovely festive season. It's really nice to see you all here in the room tonight, and also hello to anyone who's watching online. We'll just do a quick roundup of the minutes from the last meeting. So that's the minutes from the ordinary meeting of the Institute held on Wednesday, the 10th of December 2025, which was held here in the rooms of the Society of Antiquarians starting at 5 p.m. The president, that's me, was in the chair. Dr. Alistair Oswald presented a paper on patches of the endless forest, landscape monuments and remote perception in the early Neolithic of southern England. Questions were asked by Adrian Tills, Jim Hunter and Maria Medlicott. The president and the membership thanked the speaker, and the meeting ended at 6:15 p.m. Are you all happy if I sign as a record? Thank you. Okay, so it is my great pleasure this evening to welcome our speakers for the first lecture of 2026. So this evening our speakers are Doctors Jim Leary and Elaine Jamieson, both from the University of York, who are going to be presenting on a paper on a subject based in East Yorkshire, which is Life on the Lake, the Prehistory and History of Skipsea in Holderness. So should we give them all a warm welcome, and Jim's going to be starting. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Natalie, and thank you everybody for attending online and in person. As Natalie says, we're going to talk about our work in Skipsea, and it's going to be a double act. I'm going to talk for the first part about the prehistoric aspect, and I'll set some of the context. But the really good stuff that we've been digging, and we have been mostly focusing on the medieval archaeology for these first few years, Elaine will talk about. So really, I'm the warm-up act. I'm just setting the scene for the really, really good stuff to come. So Skipsea is in Holderness, in the East Riding of Yorkshire. It's right on the coast, and it's an absolutely fascinating piece of landscape. It's very flat and low-lying. On one side, on the western side, can you see that? Yeah. On the western side, we have the Yorkshire Wolds, the chalk uplands, the UK's most northern chalk upland area. And on the other side, on the eastern side, we have the North Sea, and it's bounded on the south by the river Humber and the Humber estuary itself. As I say, Holderness is this rich, flat, very watery landscape with the occasional gentle rolling hills. And in effect, it's a little piece of Doggerland. Doggerland is the Mesolithic landscape underneath the North Sea. So what we're looking at here really is an extension of that. It's a part of Doggerland that just didn't flood. But it's this incredibly resourceful area, or at least it was once a resourceful area, full of rivers and tributaries for the River Hull, that feed eventually into the River Humber, and it was full of lakes once upon a time. The lakes have now all vanished, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But there were somewhere in the region of about 70 odd lakes in Holderness, and that attracted wildlife. So throughout the Mesolithic, there would have been aurochs and elk and lots of beaver, and there's plenty of evidence for beaver in Holderness. There will have been bears in the thicker woodlands up on the Yorkshire Wolds. There would have been, at various points, wolves as well. So this is the sort of landscape we're talking about, and the sort of animals that we're talking about in prehistory, and to a certain extent into historic times as well. The lakes themselves have been drained almost entirely, except for Hornsey Mere. These lakes are known as meres in Yorkshire and also in Cumbria, which is why we have Windermere. So Hornsey Mere is still an open water lake. The rest have all been drained. Holderness also has this strange sort of otherworldly feel about it. And in the past, before the lakes had been drained and it was this sort of boggy, wet, marshy area, it would have had that even more so. There would have been a real sense of being in a slightly different world, cut off from the rest of the UK. And indeed, in historic times, people in Holderness felt that they were in a different legal system and different world to the rest of the United Kingdom. And they were quite furious. The locals were quite furious when big landowners wanted to drain their marshes and drain the lakes and turn it into productive agricultural land. And these landscapes, this sort of marshy landscape, this watery landscape where methane sort of seeps out of the peat and creates will-o'-the-wisp sort of floating on the surface, is a landscape absolutely ram-packed full of folklore. So we have, just to remind me, we have the main piece of folklore is Tiddymun. Tiddymun is a man with long, straggly white hair and a long, knotted white beard, and he comes out and he's a rather dangerous creature. He will lead you into the marshes and you will never be seen again. There's the Ord Gogi, that's one of my favourites. The Ord Gogi was this great big caterpillar that would predate on young children, particularly children that were scrumping apples from people's orchards. But there were various bogles, which are hobgoblins. There's the Burgest, which is a spectre that took the form of either a bear or a black dog, and it had these great big, large, red, flaming eyes, apparently. So it's this sort of landscape that we're talking about, this very different landscape, lovely and beautiful, rich, resourceful area, but something slightly different to the rest of the United Kingdom. And funnily enough, when these landowners wanted to drain the land and turn it into more productive farmland, they brought over Dutch engineers to drain the lakes. Quite a few of them were never seen again. And when the law came knocking to try and find out what's happened to this person, they said, Tiddymun got him. So this is the sort of world we're talking about, and it had that same feel in prehistory as well, this sort of otherworldliness. Now, we're talking about one particular mere. Skipsea is lucky enough to have 3 big lakes, 3 big meres, all of them farmers' fields now, but they would have been in prehistory and in the medieval period. Skipsea Low Mere, Skipsea Bale Mere, which is the one we're looking at, and then there's Skipsea Withow Mere, which is a little bit further away. And I just want to show you this lake. So I don't know, hopefully this will work. But this is just a little flyover, which hopefully will kick in. So what we're seeing in front of us here is the lake. You can get the edges of it here. This is the northern edge of the lake. We're digging in the northern edge just there. So now in prehistory and in historic times, this would have been open water. You can see the other side of the lake on this side. And as we swing around, you can see the other side again, the western side of the lake. Now we're coming towards Skipsea Mound. This is a castle mound, but before it was a castle mound, it was an island within the lake itself. So the mound is sitting on a natural island that would have been there through prehistory. To the distance, you can see the North Sea, so we're really not far from the coast. And I want to draw your attention to the eastern side of our lake, particularly picked out by these the yellow flowers of the oilseed rape. This is where we've been excavating. And you can see the church here, which sits on this natural ridge, this gravel ridge that forms one side of the lake. Now, here in prehistory, we would be looking at a reed-fringed open water. The way to move around in this landscape is by boat. See, this cow here is trying to do its best to recreate prehistory. And again, I think, if you use your imagination, you get a sense of this sort of slightly different world that you're in, this marshy, swampy, reed-fringed area, boggy, but with the occasional high areas. And we're now just going to fly over one of these high areas. It's not very high, but in a flat landscape, anything that brings you up above the water gets lived on, as we've found, and as Elaine will talk to you. So these are our excavations from a couple of years ago. We're swinging back round now, looking at the lake in front of us, the mound, which sits on a natural island in prehistory. So there we go. And I think that just gives you a sense of the landscape, almost in a way a better sense than you get if you're there. So we don't want that, because that's that again. So these lakes were there throughout the prehistoric period, and they've obviously filled up and captured an amazing archaeological record. And because it's waterlogged, it's preserved it very, very well. So this is Skipsea Withermere. This is the most southern of the Skipsea lakes, and it's actually being eroded by the coast. So if you go down to the beach, particularly, well, if anyone knows the landscape, they'll know Mr. Moo's ice cream parlour, a firm favourite with us and our students, which is just on the coast. And if you follow there's a beach-lined avenue from Mr. Moo's ice cream parlour down to a beautiful little beach, a big beach actually, you can see this Skipsea Withermere just eroding out of the side. Quite incredible. So after a big tide and after a storm, lots of the locals go out and they scour the beach and they look for things that have fallen out of our prehistoric lake, and they find things like, well, for example, this bone Lister point. This is a Mesolithic, Paleolithic and Mesolithic object. This one is likely early Mesolithic and used for catching fish, particularly for eels. There would have been two of them, and they act as sort of a prong on the end of a spear. So you sort of stand over the water and wait for the fish to nonchalantly swim by, and you kind of jab it and capture it that way. And a few of these have been found in the area. Most recently, a beaver dam has been eroding out of the lake, and we've been watching that quite carefully. It's amazing to watch this. This beaver dam's probably Bronze Age in date, so a few thousand years old, just eroding out onto the beach. And not long ago, a lump of beaver fur, would you believe it, a beaver pelt came out, which is now with Hull University in a Tupperware box. But the level of preservation is really remarkable, and it's just eroding out of this beach. We've been down to record it a few times. But these lakes were really important to hunter-gatherers in the Mesolithic period. They would have lived around them, they would have camped around them, hunted in them, they would have fished and fouled. They would have followed the aurochs. Aurochs are largely a wetland species. Aurochs are huge, great big wild cattle. Some of them 6 foot at the shoulder, so they're massive creatures, and they will happily sit in a lake submerged up to their back, and then they would emerge with a roar and sort of lumber up the side. And these creatures were hunted right the way through prehistory, and it would have been a rich landscape for them. So this is a really important resourceful area. We're finding lots of evidence for Mesolithic activity at the moment. It's background noise mainly, but some beautiful flints coming out of the ground. Here modelled wonderfully by one of our students, and their incredible painted fingernails. Not so incredible my hands there, but also some nice microliths and so on. So I say a general background noise. We have had a little excavation. We've mostly focused on the dry ridge, which is mainly medieval activity, but we have had some fertiling down in the lake itself. Here's one of our trenches. And what you can see here is effectively the dry land, so the lake edge, tipping down into the lake edge. So this would have been reed fringed. And then here we're sort of into the deeper part of the lake. What would have been thick water, it's now all peat underneath the farmer's field. And on this sort of lake edge, we're getting some large timbers. These are largely pieces of dead wood, so they're not anything structural, but they are sort of overhanging trees, willow and oak and so on, ancient trees that sort of hung over the edge of the lake, and some of the limbs have died and fallen off. But we're getting, as we go into the peat, we get some of these amazing things. This is actually a whole layer of beech leaves. So one autumn in the Mesolithic period, say, I don't know, 10,000 years ago, these leaves fell off the tree, floated for a little bit on the lake top, and then sunk down to the bottom to be perfectly preserved, which is what we have there. Here you can see one leaf there. Also things like insects. This is a damascel wing, the iridescent wing of a beautiful damascel. So level of preservation is amazing. Like I say, we haven't really excavated it yet. Moving on in time, we get to the Neolithic period, and again, we have evidence of the Neolithic. This is a gorgeous honey-coloured early Neolithic leaf-shaped arrowhead and a thumb scraper and a flint knife. And we know that, so not only were the hunter-gatherers interested in this resourceful lake, but of course everyone that came later were too, the Neolithic people, but especially in the Bronze and the Iron Ages. This landscape was once very famously, was once very famous amongst archaeologists and antiquarians, and quite relatively well known and excavated. It's long since been a rather forgotten bit of landscape, actually. We're hoping to sort of raise its profile again, because it's an archaeologically rich landscape. But this chap here is Thomas Boynton. Now, in the 1880s, Thomas Boynton was a farmer and a local landowner with no previous known interest in archaeology or the antiquities, but he was appointed as in charge of the section of the drain, the big drain that helped drain this landscape. He was in charge of the drain that ran through his land, the Skipsea branch of the drain, and he oversaw the work. And he noticed that in a couple of instances, particularly where the drain cuts across the edge of the lake, it intersected with a load of woodwork, just as we found some wood as well. And he did some really good excavations and some clever observations about this work. He found a site at West Firs, which is just in Skipsea Lowmere, just north of where we were digging, but also at Round Hill. He thought that he'd found part of a trackway or a platform sticking out into the lake. He wasn't a professional archaeologist, and he didn't write up or publish his work, although he did make some observations and he did do some good recording. His work wasn't actually written up and published until Reginald Smith, who was a curator at British Museum, wrote it up on his behalf nearly 30 years later. Reginald Smith, I think, did visit the site, but wasn't familiar with it at all. Reginald Smith thought that Boynton had been excavating lakeside dwellings. Boynton actually never said that. Boynton thought they were more likely trackways and platforms, but they became known as lakeside dwellings. And there was a bit of a fashion in the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century to find prehistoric lakeside dwellings. There was a load of them being found in Switzerland and in the Alpine regions. Glastonbury and Mere Iron Age settlements were being excavated, and so he interpreted them as that. In actual fact, there's no evidence that he was looking at settlements, but he was clearly looking at settlement activity. So this is his work at West Firs. Round Hill, our trench was just on the other side of the drain, of the Barnton drain. Round Hill was found there. Round Hill was very interesting because there was an awful lot of both sites had an awful lot of artifacts associated with them, but including things like this amber bead, probably Bronze Age, but actually depending on, because of the date of the work we've been doing, we have been wondering whether there might be a bit of early medieval activity going on there. But The sites are clearly important, and they clearly need looking at again. It's been rather overlooked in the archaeological record. Robert van der Noort, who's now the Vice-Chancellor at Reading University, did do a project in the 90s in very small-scale test pitting. But other than that, it's seen no widespread excavation. We really feel that this is something that needs to be done. So that's hopefully one of the outcomes of, we're not actually excavating exactly this area, but hopefully one of the outcomes of our project. So we have Mesolithic activity around the lake edge, we have Neolithic, we have lots of Bronze Age, but it also goes into the Iron Age, and there's good Iron Age evidence, lots of pottery. There's also a series of skulls that were found at Round Hill, and there's another skull that was found somewhere, I think around there, around here in this field, much more recently. Mel Giles from Manchester University has been analysing it. He was known locally as George. He was sitting on a mantelpiece, I think, for a long time, but he's currently being investigated, and he seems to be an Iron Age skull. We wonder whether maybe there's a little bit of an Iron Age cult going on. And, remember what I say about this being sort of quite an interesting ritualistic landscape, something slightly other than other parts of the UK. We've found similar Iron Age activity. In fact, the reason that Elaine and I came to work at Skipsea was because 10 years ago, or over 10 years ago now, we did a project known as the Round Mounds Project, where we were hoping to replicate my work at the Marlborough Mound in Wiltshire, which showed that the castle motte was actually an earlier prehistoric mound. And so we had funding from the Leary Trust to go around the country coring lots of castle mottes and dating them. We were completely wrong, and nearly every mound we looked at is actually medieval in date. A few that aren't, some later, and a couple that are a little bit earlier. But one of them was Skipsea, and actually the dates for Skipsea Mound came back as Iron Age. We think that the mound itself, or at least the origin of the mound, was probably an Iron Age mound. And interestingly, in the Iron Age, in this part of Yorkshire, there is a mound building tradition. They put mounds over their a number of their burials. We just think Skipsea is a really massive one. And of course, let's remember, this was an island in the middle of a lake, so quite sort of an interesting landscape. So here we are. This is us 10 years ago coring it. Well, this is not me and Elaine. This is obviously the two other people working on it, but we got these wonderful Iron Age dates, which made some headline news around the world. So that's the broader prehistoric background. We haven't really had a chance to look at it very much at the moment. Just this is that ridge that I talked about, the eastern side of the lake. And in one of the trenches, we actually picked up right down in the bottom of the trench, we think we're right next to a spring. It's very waterlogged, and it feels like we're next to a spring line, probably a little spring that then fed into Skipsea Bale Mere. And right next to that spring is a whole load of Iron Age activity, dating from we think probably from the Middle Iron Age right the way through to the end of the Iron Age, even the very beginning of the Roman period, in fact. And again, we haven't really opened a huge trench at the moment, but just in our little trench, we've got these masses of quantities of pot coming out. It looks very, I don't know, dare I say it, depositional, really. It might be that there's a series of Iron Age roundhouses nearby, and they're just chucking out their rubbish and pots into this sort of wetland area nearby. But it feels a bit more placed than that, I have to be honest. So here's some of the really big fresh sherds we've been finding. And this is the sort of density. Each one of these is a little cluster again of pots, fragments of barrel jars and so on. We also have and we think of the same sort of date, so an Iron Age date, what we're calling a bag of bones. This is a collection of animal bones, mainly cattle, but there might be a few other species in there too. They're still being analysed. They've been broken up, the marrow has been removed, so clearly this is evident, this is the remains of a big meal, of a feast, if you like, and it's clearly been put into a bag. the bag has since rotted away and it's kind of retained a bit of a shape. So we're just calling it this sort of bag of bones. And again, it's got this feel of quite deliberate placed deposits going on there. Now, in amongst all of this pottery was this rather amazing find. This is actually a fossilized ammonite, but it's been worked and it's had the inside has been completely sort of ground out. So it's, I think, probably been turned into a pendant or something. And again, this is quite a common, well, not common, but this is a known feature of the Iron Age. They sort of use fossils to create pendants. And let's not forget that this is the landscape in which the Radiocarbon figures were found. These are Iron Age wooden statuettes. There's 5 of them. 4 of them would have stood in this amazing wooden boat with a sort of dragon head or a serpent's head. Fierce quartzite eyes. They were clearly warriors. They had swords and they had shields. They've also got these most amazing, great big dangling penises, which are detachable, incidentally, as are their arms. They're sort of these peg dolls in a sense. But this has clearly been ritually deposited. This is at Radiocarbon, which is not too far away from Skipsea. So this is the sort of environment we're in. Anyway, that I think, and we're now in that little area getting below the Iron Age, and we're getting earlier. We haven't got any radiocarbon dates from this yet, but I think we're probably into either maybe the Bronze Age or the Neolithic period. Hopefully we'll get into the Mesolithic under that too. So that's all really to say that there's a huge amount of potential for this, and that the prehistory looks really quite amazing. But we haven't excavated huge amounts of it yet. I should have said right at the beginning that we run this as our field school. So this is the University of York's main field school. This is where our first year undergraduates, 120 of them, come out with us each year, get their first taste of digging for many of them. And it's a really wonderful landscape to learn in because there's a bit of dryland, there's a bit of wetland, there's a bit of medieval, a bit of prehistory. There's a little bit of everything for everyone. The only thing we don't have at the moment, thank goodness, is Roman archaeology, but I'm sure that will probably turn up at some point as well. So anyway, that's hopefully built up a little bit of a picture to the landscape, and now I'm going to pass over to Elaine, who's going to talk about the medieval side.
Wonderful, thank you, Jim. You've seen this photograph again before, but I think it's just a great way of looking across the landscape and seeing the different components in it. Now, in the medieval period, Jim talked about the sort of special nature of this landscape, and it was actually called the island of Holderness in the medieval period. So again, they still saw it as a kind of detached bit of landscape. The earliest references we have to this area really come from the Domesday Book, where it was owned by Harold Godwinson at Domesday. So a very unusual detached holding. He only had sort of 3 areas that he held north of the Humber. So unusual to have a piece of land held by Earl Harold at that time. And after the conquest, it was then given to a chap called Drogo de la Beuvrière, who was a kind of key ally of William the Conqueror and was in fact married to his niece. Unfortunately, he seemed to have murdered his wife. And because of that, he fled back to France to sort of avoid the wrath of William the Conqueror. So the area quickly passed over to a chap called Odo Champagne. And the whole of the Holderness area was given over as like an honour. So a whole group of estates were kind of bundled together into a sort of block of land and owned by the same landowner or ruled by the same landowner, just so there was a kind of power base or power centre in that region. So that's the kind of background, historical background in the medieval period. You can see the mound that Jim talked about. That's the castle that was built in that post-conquest period. And that was the best known medieval monument from that area. And when we've been looking on this ridge, we've actually found a whole other medieval component that wasn't known of at all before. The first thing we did across this area was do some geophysical survey, and it built up a whole series of anomalies. Some of them are natural, some of them are cultural, but what it really showed us that on the ridge, the gravel ridge, the dry area, there was a focus of activity going on up there. And we had a whole series of anomalies, as we would call them, in the geophysical survey, and targets for us to look at as part of our project. I'm going to kind of go through these, not necessarily as we found them, but in a kind of what we believe to be the chronology of when they were created. So we have a series of amazing buildings that we've discovered, and no more so than this structure here. We're calling it a corn drying complex at the moment. But hopefully what you can see from this aerial shot of it and from the photograph is it comprises a clay floor, a sort of sub-rectangular clay floor that seems to have had a series of timber posts around the outside of it. So we're looking at a kind of covered structure, some kind of building. And then at the northern end of it, we've got a kind of circular feature, and we believe this is a kiln or an oven at one end of it. So we have a structure with a kiln at one end. There is lots of wattle and daub remains, so the kiln is obviously burnt down, and we've got lots of structural daub. That was the thing that we saw when we opened the trenches at first, was all these pieces of structural daub. And you can see it's still a work in progress. We've excavated half of it, so we're going to carry on excavating the whole of the structure next year. Now, we got some material for radiocarbon dating from it, and you can see the dates that I've put up here. So we're looking at something that seems likely to be 8th or 9th century. So actually quite a lot earlier than the castle, and actually earlier than we thought these structures might be. So this is something really intriguing. We're looking at the form of it and looking for comparable sites. And the other thing that we found as part of it was some clay remains, and we've interpreted these as parts of a clay oven, and we think this oven was actually part of the kiln, and for some reason when it's been dismantled or abandoned, the clay from the oven has been pulled out and disposed of. Because of the form of it, we think what we're looking at is possibly a malt house. So essentially the clay floor representing the germination floor, and the kiln, the sort of drying kiln where it was, where the corn was then dried. So this is a really interesting structure, and there's relatively few of them that have been found. Very couple that are known of, really. So if that is the case, then this is a really intriguing discovery and a really interesting find. Obviously, the really important thing for telling this is the environmental remains. And again, we're still looking at the environmental evidence. But what we can see from our preliminary investigations is that we've got a whole series of different cereals that are coming up. We've got hulled barley and free threshing wheat. And that's really indicative of that early medieval period, these crops. So we were quite confident when we got that interpretation that we weren't looking at something that was Roman, much to Jim's joy. But we've also got oats and rye, and this is giving us an idea of the different crops that they were growing in this region as well. The thing that really stood out to us is that there was evidence for germination in some of the crops, and as I say, as we look at them more, we'll have an idea of the percentage of germinated grain that we've got. And that's really what's giving us this idea that we've got a malt house, that we've got a grain that has been germinated on the germination floor. So essentially it's soaked in a steeping tank, then it germinates and it's then dried off on the germination floor and in the kiln. So it's this sort of process that goes on. The other thing that was really noticeable is that there was an absence of chaff. So we're definitely looking at a process that's using semi-cleaned grain. So we're not looking at a threshing barn, for example, where the grain's been brought in, stored and threshed. that's actually been sort of semi-cleaned before being brought to our site. The other thing is we did find remains of sort of cereal-based products, so bread, porridge, indicating there's some domestic activity going on up there as well. But as I say, it's still ongoing, looking at that material. But it's giving us this sort of fascinating insight to what might be going on at this building. Now, the building itself doesn't sit in isolation. It's got a whole series of gullies or possibly wall trenches surrounding it. These are multiple phases, and we could create a sort of relative chronology for these by how they cut each other, essentially. We've got this sort of a really amazing sort of horseshoe-shaped gully. And it seems really clear to us when we've been excavating it that this is a feature that's been repaired and replaced. So in some areas we've got kind of double gullies, not all the way around, so it's been replaced and repaired in sections. So it's been a structure that's gone on for a period of time. The interesting thing about the malt house is it needs to have a steeping tank to wet the grain, and we are just wondering whether we've got an area that actually contained the steeping tank, and it would have been something that is above ground, possibly a timber tank that the grain was soaked in, and we wouldn't have really any remains of that. Perhaps this structure was where that sat, and its very close relationship to the rest of the building sort of makes that a possibility. Again, we got some material for radiocarbon dating to try and get a sequence for these trenches. And we got broadly comparable dates to the structure. Actually, the sample 2 that came from the horseshoe-shaped gully was almost identical to the date that we got from the corn drying structure. So we're very much looking at something that's sort of 8th, 9th century. Now, because this is an early medieval site, then we don't have a great deal of finds from it, much to our students' disappointment. But what we do have is really quite indicative of multiple phases of activity going on, but also quite a lot of different crafting activities going on. So one of the most common finds that we've got are hone stones and whetstones. So clearly there's a lot of blade sharpening going on, as you might expect, and these are common finds in the early medieval period. But we've also got stone spindle whorls, so possibly cloth manufacturing going on. I've put up an example of this sort of perforated shale disc, and we think this was being worked and has been broken. So possibly they're manufacturing objects as well. We've also got horn cores, very much like Jim's horn core that you found from the prehistoric levels, suggesting that they might have been working bone as well. So we've got these different crafting activities going on the site. Now, just to the south of our corn drying complex, we have another structure which is kind of sub-rectangular in form. It's about 3.5 by 4 metres, and it's sunken into the ground, so this sort of sunken pit. And we've just actually tickled the surface of this at the moment. And again, when we saw this at first, we thought we were possibly looking at a sunken featured building, so something that was early medieval. But we got some radiocarbon dates from the fill of it, so the layer that filled it. And they give us a date of sort of 10th to 12th century or 11th to 12th century. So suggested we were looking at something that was open much later than we'd initially thought. We thought we were looking at something that was possibly 6th or 7th century. So we're looking at something that's actually later than our corn drying complex, so something that came after it. You can see that it's lined in timber, and the structure has been burnt, so the timber had been burnt in situ. So we've got oak planking round the outside of it. We also, we think, have sort of oak or posts in the corners of it. And we've also recovered mortar from this area as well. And there was a big lump of mortar that actually had mortar or timber sandwiched with mortar. So I think that's part of the fabric of the structure that we're seeing that's possibly collapsed into the pit. And then the pit itself has been filled with stones. So what we think we've probably got is a sort of cellared building, possibly a timber tower. So I've put up 2 examples here to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. There's only a few of these have actually been excavated, but one of the most famous sort of pictures of these towers is from the Bay Tapestry. And again, this is thought to be at Bosham in Sussex. And this is actually Earl Harold's main residence. And they're actually watching for him coming back from France. That's the story being told there. So suggesting that possibly this is a lookout tower, something like that. But they could also be bell towers. They could also be tower nave churches. And we see those actually developing in stone in sort of slightly later periods, by the time you're getting into the 11th century. And this is an example of a stone tower that's got strap work on it that's indicative of timber, suggesting that these are harking back to what they would have looked like when they were made in timber. And that's being replicated in the early structures in stone. So we're not exactly sure what ours is, whether it's a lookout tower, a bell tower, or a tower nave church, but it's a really, really exciting and intriguing find. And again, is indicative of a high status settlement. We're looking at something that would only really be found on a kind of elite centre. So it's giving us an idea of the sort of level of activity we've got at our site. We have another really interesting structure that was actually what we found first. This was the thing that we could see really clearly in the geophysical survey. And you can see here it's picked out as a whole series of paired post holes to the north of our tower, or our sunk cellared building. And it defines a building that's over 60 metres long and nearly 6 metres wide. So we're looking at a really large structure. It's proved really difficult to date this structure because it just remains as cut features. And we had 2 radiocarbon dates from one of the post holes. One was Roman and one was early medieval, and the Roman was above the early medieval, so we're just dating residual material, so it's proved really difficult. However, you can hopefully see in this photograph that what it does do is one of the posts punches through the floor of our corn drying kiln, suggesting that it's later than that. So we've got sort of relatively secure dates for that, suggesting that we're looking at something that's possibly 10th, 11th century or later than that. So it could be that that is contemporary with our tower. It's also been built and rebuilt on the same footprint. So we've got post holes that are intercutting, so they've been replaced or repairing it. And because of having it's been built in the same place, then clearly it's important to have this structure where it is and in the same place, and it's important enough to be repaired. The other thing that's really noticeable about it, and we noticed this when we were excavating it, you can see it really clearly in these aerial photographs, that it sits aligned really on the mound. And I think that might be significant that they're referencing the mound and the island at that time. They could have placed this really anywhere along this ridge, but they selected this location. So I think it's really noticeable that it seems to be aligned on the mound. I've put this example up of a sort of reconstruction, and this is of an Anglo-Saxon settlement at Bishopston in West Sussex, and this was excavated by Gabor Thomas. And I put up this image really because it shows a tower or a sunk or cellared building that they've interpreted as a tower as part of a complex of medieval buildings. And it just may be that we have got the similar sort of thing going on at Skipsea. We've got this sort of high-status elite centre and a complex of buildings that we're finding. And although this one that you can see here dated from, I think, the 9th or the 10th century, we're thinking of something that's possibly 10th, 11th century in date. So just that kind of pre-conquest period. So earlier than the castle, so predating the castle, but it might start to give us an idea of why the castle was actually built there. Why did they actually build the Norman castle in that location? And it may be to do that there was a high status centre, an important regional centre there before the castle. Another interesting feature that we found was what we call our road. And this was, we saw this almost as soon as we took off the topsoil when we were opening the trench. And the farmer that we're working with, he just said, well, we don't get that round here. We've got this band of chalk going straight across the trench. And chalk isn't found locally, it doesn't outcrop locally, so this material's been brought to the site. And we're convinced what we've got is the base of a roadway running along the ridge. And interestingly, when we looked back at our earlier excavations, we actually saw that we had found evidence of this underneath our timber structure, so our Great Hall structure. So part of this road had been lifted and removed when they built that, so it predates that structure. So whether it was something that was giving access to the corn drying kiln or the malt house, we're just not sure. The other thing that we thought was about the stones that were filling our cellared structure or our tower. You can see the road just behind it. And it may be what they did was take the stones off that road, decommission that road, and fill up the cellared structure with those stones. And it's interestingly that they very deliberately filled this structure with the stones. It's almost as if they're closing it down and some kind of sort of ritual end to the site. Because a lot of work with all these tips of stones and moving it around. So there's something interesting going on here. We're going to go back next year and we're going to start lifting these stones out. And I think that's going to be really fascinating to see what's sealed underneath. Whether we've got the floor levels, whether we've got activity in the floor, whether we've got more evidence of what this structure would have looked like. The final kind of key element of this sort of elite centre that we're talking about is an enclosure ditch that surrounds it. This was one of the reasons that we were actually drawn to this area in the first place. You can see here the first edition map, and this is from the sort of 1850s. And you can see Sparrowcroft marked on it, and they actually mark an earthwork surrounding it at that time. And this aerial photograph from 2018 really clearly shows the enclosure ditch. And we put a trench across the enclosure ditch in the first year that we were there. We found that it was relatively modest, and actually what they did was enhance it by using the edge of the gravel ridge to make this look larger. And they might also have thrown material up onto the top of it and made it look like a more imposing kind of earthwork in its own right. There's a series of fills in the ditch, and one of the sort of secondary fills contained pottery, sort of mid-11th century to early 14th century, so really that kind of pre-conquest or post-conquest sort of period pottery. And that was in one of the secondary fills, indicating that the ditch predates that. So it could be that we have a ditch surrounding a centre that's actually associated with our cellared structure and our Great Hall kind of structure, rather than being something later. But this is exactly what you'd expect from that period. You'd expect there to be an enclosed area that had an elite centre within it. Again, there's relatively few small finds that have been coming out of all of this. We've got some coinage, but most of the coinage is much later and has come from the topsoil, to be honest. So I haven't found anything in secure contexts. And it's mostly 13th century kind of long cross pennies. Some personal objects. So we've got part of a perforated buckle, which is 11th century in date. And we've also got part of a shale or jet finger ring. And this is the kind of story of the site. We're getting little bits, little scraps of things, but giving us an indication that there's sort of high status activity. We've also done a sort of survey, a project doing metal detecting survey across the whole of our field and the field next door, and we've been working with local metal detectorists to do this. And we've got over 250 objects just from a single sweep across these two fields. And it's giving us an insight into what's going on in the area more broadly. Interestingly, Jim mentioned that we don't have much in the way of evidence for Roman activity. In the whole of the metal detecting finds, we have one diagnostic Roman artifact, which is this rather lovely enamel disc brooch. But that's the only thing that we have found, giving us an idea that there's really no Roman activity going on in this ridge. We've got prehistoric activity, and we've got the early medieval, but we've got this really obvious gap. The other thing that's brought up is really other activity going on slightly later. So we've got this spindle whorl indicating, again, more craft activity. But as you might expect, because we're right next to a lake, what we've also found as part of this survey is evidence for fishing on the lake. So we've got this rather lovely medieval net sinker, and we've got a lot of lead lime weights as well. And these come from closer to the lake edge, so indicating that there's lots of fishing going on along the lake edge. And we have actually got some bird bones from our excavation. So we have this kind of image of fishing and fouling on the lake from that time. So as Jim has said, and as I've said several times, it's an ongoing project, and hopefully the sort of more exciting discoveries are going to come out of it. We're going to be back there this March, May, let's get it right, I'll go the right month. Going to be back there this May, and we're going to be continuing excavating for another, this year and another 2 years afterwards. And the idea is to look in more detail at some of these structures that we've found and move down the ridge, looking at more evidence of the medieval site before going, well, we will go on as well and look at the prehistoric evidence, which we're kind of doing in tandem. So hopefully there'll be new things to talk about moving forward. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
I should be much louder. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure our audience did too. And do we have any questions for our speakers? Yes, Isabel.
Yeah, that was very interesting. I'm particularly interested in the Iron Age base of the medieval mound. So what sort of proportion are we talking about if this is, presumably you suspect that this may be one of these Iron Age burial mounds? Are we talking about something big or small? Or
we don't know. The mound now is 13 metres high and is something like 85 metres in diameter, so it's massive. The evidence we have is Iron Age dates for the first, I think it's about the first metre at least. And then we don't have any other dates other than a medieval one right at the top. So it's that concentration of Iron Age dates in the first sort of metre of it implies that at least the nub of it is an Iron Age mound. It's not impossible that, so if it is just a metre high mound, then that puts it in the same sort of ballpark as the other, maybe towards the larger size of the sort of square enclosured barrows, Iron Age barrows. If the whole thing is Iron Age, and we're not saying that at all, but if it is, then there's nothing like it in Britain. You have to really look towards the continent where they do have these, what they call princely burials, and they are about 13 metres roughly, and about 85 metres in diameter. Homicella, is that the name of it? Yeah. So, you do have examples on the continent. What's interesting about the Iron Age in East Yorkshire is that it is very continental looking. It's not quite the same as any other Iron Age in Britain. It sort of looks out across the waters. So who knows? I think the question is there, but we have no evidence that the whole mound is Iron Age. Only the first sort of metre of it is.
Which is, in a sense, yeah. So you've got something which could be normal or could be completely
Yes.
exceptional.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think whatever it is really, really interesting. I think it is much bigger than the other barrows generally. The fact that it's on an island in the middle of a big lake also sets it slightly apart as well. So we've got something, it needs further work. And what we would really like to do is to do some non-intrusive tomography or something that will see into the mound to see if
And presumably there might be a burial at the bottom.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a big princely burial, then we'd be looking at a chamber and a whole bunch of other things. If it's your bog standard chariot burial, then that should be evident as well. So, whatever, it's really interesting, and I think the fact it's on this island, the fact that we've got these really quite well, these interesting things going on in the Iron Age and the Bronze Age as well, all around that lake is interesting. The skulls, again, implies something slightly different is going on there.
Getting the context.
Yeah.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, thank you both. Really interesting. I've got two, I don't know whether they're questions, but anyway, the thoughts. First is about the geology of the area and were the meres, were the meres linked to the sea, to open water, and is there any evidence of migrations of people into that in the prehistoric times?
So the lakes generally are linked to one another. They sort of form a whole series of almost like pearl necklaces all the way down Holderness, and they feed generally into the Humber, into the River Hull, which then feeds into the Humber. So they don't go out to the North Sea. They actually sort of come down, and then it's taken out to the North Sea.
They do now because they cut a channel into the North Sea, but they didn't in prehistory or in the medieval period.
Interestingly, at Skipsea itself, the waters generally flowed north, and then they looped around and joined into the Hull and came. Right. Then went south. So that's the question about the lakes. In terms of immigration, well, I mean, it's the same as most other places in the UK. We're kind of getting a much better understanding of immigration and the makeup of people throughout prehistory, through ancient DNA. We're recognizing that there are influxes at various points. So, the hunter-gatherers in Holderness will be basically the people being displaced from Doggerland. So as the sea levels are rising and Doggerland is flooding, people are moving into Britain and also the other way, and presumably then being cut off, although that's a much discussed point. And then we see a degree of isolation before we can now see in the beginning of the Neolithic period an influx of people with their heritage that goes all the way can be traced back to Anatolia, back to the Near East. So then, and that almost entirely, not quite, but almost entirely replaces the hunter-gatherer genetic makeup over a long period of time. No sense of, sort of invasion or anything like that. Not Nigel Farage's worst nightmare or anything. It's just, people coming over in drips and drabs in their skin boats and farming and eventually replacing the hunter-gatherers who are probably, to be honest, quite thinly scattered anyway. We can see more, again, at the beginning of the Bronze Age, we can see another influx. Around about the Middle Bronze Age, there's another influx of people, and so it goes on. So we can see these sort of pulses and influxes of people and genes being replaced. None of us in Britain can claim that we are related to the Mesolithic or even the Neolithic. We are a product of immigration, all of us. So Yeah, so we can see that, but in Holderness itself, well, unfortunately, at the moment, our studies are very sort of big scale, and they're not refined to that kind of a level. One day maybe they will be, but we do need the burial evidence to show that.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I didn't see much about the burials other than the mention with the mound and the possibility, but that would be high status, I'm guessing, or...
Yeah, I mean, so, that at the moment, that mound covering a burial is pure guesswork, and I think quite good, I think perfectly reasonable guesswork at this stage, but guesswork. But in the area, we do have lots of Iron Age burials, very distinct burials, really, really interesting ones. There's lots of work going on about ancient DNA, which I can't tell you about at the moment because I don't know. But that will show sort of, I suppose, a degree of regional migration.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, these studies, ancient DNA studies, are quite big scale at the moment.
Right.
They're becoming ever more refined. But
Lots more to see then, coming.
oh yeah, it's an amazing time to be interested in archaeology because there's so many changes. And you write a book, as I did recently, and you realise it's gone out of date because there's new stuff all the time. I'm writing a book about the Neolithic at the moment, and it's a nightmare. I just want to say, everyone, let's just have an amnesty for 2 years now. No more publications. Stop. Then do your stuff. And my book's fine.
This is where archaeology meets technology, is it?
Yeah, no, it's such an exciting time, though, it really is. And we can talk about stuff now that we could never have spoken about even 10 years ago. Let alone going back 20, 30 years. When I was an undergraduate 30 years ago, I mean, it's a different picture now. So, yeah, it's really, really exciting. So much happening.
Good. Thank you both.
If I can get it to work. Thank you very much. Fascinating. You mentioned the timbers and the leaves in the deposits. Have you done any work on pollen analysis for the vegetation in the landscape?
Yeah, so that's all ongoing work. We've had Barry Taylor, who worked at Starcar. Starcar's not very far away, and amazing. For anyone that doesn't know, look it up. There's lots of publications, nice popular publications, but an amazing Mesolithic site. And Barry worked at Starcar, and he's been working with us. We also have our own pollen people from York University on it. So it's kind of ongoing work. And in 3 years' time, hopefully we'll have a much better picture. But yeah, because preservation is so good, we should be able to have a really clear sense of what that local landscape looked like. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, were there any further questions for our speakers this evening?
Thank you. Could you tell me sort of when the site was abandoned? How long do we think that it was used, inhabited?
In the medieval period, presumably. So, Elaine, do you want to answer?
Yeah. And why? Well, we could suggest that when they built the castle, that the site that we've been excavating then went out of use. But we have got evidence that there was things going on there at that time. So we've got pottery that dates from the post-conquest period. We've got coinage that dates from the post-conquest period. So it's difficult to say exactly when it went out of use. If you look at the historical record, they suggest the castle itself went out of use in the early 13th century. But we have got evidence there's activity going on longer than that. So it's not really clear. We can say that the condrying or the malt house had gone out of use before the big timber structure was built on top of it. And the fact that it didn't destroy it suggests that it might have gone out of use quite a long time before that structure was built. But as it stands at the moment, we're thinking 13th century, that kind of time that it probably all went out of use, or possibly earlier than that. We just don't know at the moment.
I'd add to that Elaine has an idea that when the castle was built, there was a sort of reorientation of the whole of the castle round to the other side, and it kind of left our little settlement on the ridge not completely abandoned, because we've got little bits of later evidence, but mostly abandoned. And there are huge earthworks around that other side. which is sort of another aspect of our project that Elaine is kind of working on. So, yeah.
Apologies if it's a slightly naive question. Sometimes for me, every day is a school day. The missing Roman connection. Geographically, where is the nearest, largest, or large Roman establishment in relation to Holderness itself? Because they must have been using the River Humber.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, absolutely. And
So there's no evidence they were stopping on the River Humber and using Holderness. So
no, they are using Holderness, and I think Dig Ventures have been excavating a big Roman settlement nearby, not too far away. Not exactly Skipsea, but not far away in Holderness. Of course, you only need to go a little bit further north, and there's the Roman villa. I forget the name of it. Eastfield's just been excavated on the coast.
You've got the Roman town at Malton as well.
Roman town of Malton.
And there's a whole series of Roman roads cut across that landscape, and they all stop when they get to Holderness, because nobody's quite sure where it's going, what's going on. But you've got times on the other side of the roads as well. So there is quite a lot of Roman activity in the area, and there is sort of Roman farmsteads sort of known from Holderness. But in our landscape, I think it's just interesting because we've got all this prehistoric activity, and you'd think that there'd be this sort of continuation of settlement, not continuous settlement, but reusing the same sorts of sites. So it's just interesting that we don't have any evidence of Roman activity. It seems to be abandoned in prehistory and then resettled again in early modern.
But that in itself is really, really interesting, and there is a sort of a growing understanding that after the collapse of the Roman Empire and the kind of chaos that ensues, people do look back towards prehistory, towards the Iron Age, as kind of, almost in a sense, and I know that a load of Roman specialists will balk at this, but a sense of, the oppressors have gone, and actually you can look back to your roots, and so you sort of see hill forts being reoccupied, and a general movement back to some Iron Age sites. And I think that that's what we're seeing in Skipsea, is that, the area is just not utilised in the Roman period. As soon as that's gone, people are being pulled back into it, because after all, it's a wonderfully rich landscape. So, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, well, I hope that's whetted your appetite for also having a look at the project on Digging for Britain, which you're on episode 4, I believe.
Episode 4, 28th of January.
Or available on iPlayer right now, if you want to get into it. So I think we should show our appreciation once again for our fantastic speakers this evening. Thank you so much. And we will hopefully look forward to seeing you all at the next lecture, which will be on the 11th of February, which will be Dr. Rob Dinnis taking us back into deep, deep prehistory. And he's going to be talking about the evidence for early Homo sapiens in Britain. So, okay, thank you all for coming, and see you again.